You've never seen a storm like this before." The words echoed in James Turner's mind as he watched the wild current swirl violently around the rocks. A sudden flood had appeared out of nowhere, turning the usually calm stream into a deadly force of nature. James had been tending to his cattle when the rain began, then the thunder. At first, it seemed like just another summer storm, but this was different. The water rose too fast, the sky too dark, and the winds howled like they had a mind of their own. James stood at the edge of the riverbank, staring at the turbulent water, his thoughts racing. He never could have imagined that today, his life would change forever. He was about to make a decision that would cost him more than he could have ever known. Just then, through the thickening rain, he saw her. A figure, struggling against the current, her long black hair whipping around her face. It was a woman, no, a girl, trapped by the wild water. She was caught in the whirlpool, her body tossed and pulled in every direction by the strength of the river. Her screams were muffled by the storm, but the desperation in them was unmistakable. Without thinking, James ran. The sound of his boots hitting the wet ground was drowned out by the crashing waves, but he didn't care. There was only one thing in his mind now: get to her before it was too late. The water was freezing cold, biting into his skin as he waded deeper, each step a battle against the rushing stream. He could barely see through the sheets of rain, but he spotted her again, her head above the water for just a moment before being pulled down once more. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed forward, fighting the current with all his strength. Finally, with a desperate lunge, he grabbed her arm and pulled her towards him. The force of the water was overwhelming, but he managed to get a firm grip on her, holding her close to his chest. Her body was limp, her face pale and bruised from the struggle. He didn't know how long he had been in the water, but it felt like an eternity. Every inch of his body screamed with cold, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let go. Together, they made it. To the bank. Gasping for breath, James collapsed onto the muddy shore, cradling the girl in his arms. She was unconscious, her body trembling violently from the shock. James checked her pulse, weak, but steady. She was alive. He had saved her. But as he looked down at her, he saw something that stopped his heart. Her clothes were torn, her body covered in marks, signs of something more than just the river. There was a history in her eyes, a story he didn't understand but knew he would soon. She was Apache. That much was clear. The weight of that realization hit him hard. This wasn't just any girl. She was part of a world he didn't know, a world that would soon be coming for her, and for him. As the storm began to ease, James stayed with her, unsure of what came next, but knowing one thing for certain: his life was about to change, and there was no turning back. James sat beside the girl, her breathing slow but steady. The rain had stopped, and the sky had begun to clear, but the storm had left a deep, eerie silence in its wake. He glanced down at her, still trying to process what had just happened. She was smaller than he had first thought, delicate in the way she lay against the mud, yet something about her seemed different. As if she carried a strength within her, one that was not immediately visible. Her clothes, though torn and wet, bore the markings of someone who had lived through hardships far beyond what a normal person should. James's fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve, and he caught a glimpse of the beads that adorned her wrist, strangely beautiful, yet ancient. They looked like they carried stories of their own, stories that would probably remain untold. He didn't know much about Apache culture, but he could feel the weight of history in those beads. The girl stirred, a faint moan escaping her lips. James quickly moved closer, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "Hey, you're safe now," he whispered, unsure if she could hear him. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing deep, dark brown eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken words. She blinked several times, confused, before focusing on him. Who are you?" she asked, her voice raspy, strained from the ordeal. "James Turner," he replied, his voice soft but steady. I saved you from the river. You're safe now." The girl tried to sit up but winced, clutching her side. James gently pushed her back down, careful not to cause her any more pain. You should rest. You've been through a lot. She hesitated for a moment, studying him, as if unsure whether to trust him. Then, finally, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Ayanna, she said simply. I'm Ayanna. Her name echoed in his mind. There was something powerful about it. It felt as if it carried the weight of a tribe, a culture, a history. He nodded, understanding more than she realized. Ayanna, he repeated softly, feeling the gravity of the moment. He sat back, watching her carefully. He could tell she was still in pain, but there was something else in her eyes, a fire, a resilience that couldn't be broken by a storm, a river, or anything else. James couldn't help but feel a deep respect for her, even though they had just met. He wondered what brought her here, alone, in the middle of a storm. Why was she out there? What had she been running from? Ayanna seemed to sense his curiosity. She shifted slightly, still not fully trusting him, but too tired to say anything. I need to get back, she said, her voice stronger now. My people, they'll be looking for me. James frowned, unsure of what she meant. People? He asked, his mind racing. Ayanna nodded, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. The Apache. My tribe. They will come for me. Her words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, James wasn't sure how to respond. He had heard of the Apache before, of course, but he didn't know much about them. His life had always been centered around his ranch, his cattle, his land. The world beyond that felt like a distant dream. But now, here she was, a living connection to that world. He didn't know what to say. He had saved her, but what did that mean now? Would her people see him as a hero? Or would they see him as a threat? And what did it mean for him? Would they come looking for him? Ayanna shifted again, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his heart race. You don't understand, she said quietly. They won't stop until they know I'm safe. And they'll do anything to protect me. James's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what to make of her words. But as he looked into her eyes, he knew one thing for sure, whatever happened next, his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. And whether he liked it or not, he was now part of something far bigger than himself. James couldn't stop the thoughts swirling in his mind. The weight of Ayanna's words hung heavy in the air, and he couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of uncertainty. She had said her people would come for her. But what did that really mean for him? His ranch, his life, everything he had worked for, could it all change in an instant because of one person? He wasn't sure what to make of it, but one thing was clear, his life had already been turned upside down by a simple act of kindness. He had saved a girl from a storm, and now, there were forces beyond his control at play. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land as James stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. He glanced back at Ayanna, who was sitting quietly on the ground, her head bowed. The moment felt surreal. Here he was, a simple rancher, and there she was, a girl with a past he couldn't even begin to understand. He wondered about her tribe, about the life she had left behind. What had brought her here, to this very spot? Was it fate or something more? Before he could dwell on it further, a distant sound broke his thoughts. The steady rhythm of hooves approaching. James froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The riders were here. He could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. His eyes scanned the horizon, and there they were. A small group of riders, moving steadily toward his ranch. They were not the friendly faces he was used to seeing. Their posture, their gait, their purpose, it was different. They were coming for Ayanna. He could feel it in his bones. The riders were silent as they approached, their horses moving with precision, their bodies cloaked in shadows as the sun dipped lower in the sky. James's mind raced. Should he hide her? Should he confront them? He had no idea what they would do. He had no idea who they were, or what they were capable of. But Ayana's voice broke through his thoughts, calm and steady. "They're here." James turned to look at her. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. She wasn't afraid. "They are not here to harm you," she said quietly. "They are here to bring me home." James felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. He didn't know what she meant by home, but it sounded like this was a turning point, a moment where the past and future collided. He stood up and walked toward the edge of his ranch, his eyes fixed on the riders. He could see them now, 5, maybe 6 of them. Their horses moved with purpose, their figures cloaked in the twilight. As they drew closer, James could make out their features. They were Apache, just like Ayana. The leader of the group rode ahead, his presence commanding the others to fall into line behind him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that glimmered in the fading light. James's heart skipped a beat. This man was no stranger. He had seen him before, years ago, on the outskirts of his land. It was Chief Dakota, the leader of the Apache tribe Ayana belonged to. The chief's eyes met James's from a distance, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. There was a sense of recognition in his gaze, but it was also laced with something else, something James couldn't quite place. The chief spoke first, his voice carrying across the field with authority. "You saved my daughter." The words felt heavy, each one carrying the weight of years of tradition, honor, and duty. James stood tall, his hands slightly trembling as he answered, "I did what anyone would do." Dakota's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You have done more than that," he said. "And now, you will face the consequences." James didn't understand what he meant by that. Was he being threatened? Was Ayana in danger? Before he could ask, Dakota continued, "I do not come here to fight, but to thank you for saving her. You have earned our respect. But there is more to this story, more than you know." James's mind raced again. What did he mean by that? And what would come next? The air was thick with tension, and the sunset bathed the scene in an eerie glow. James stood there, unsure of what would happen next, but certain of one thing: his life was no longer just his own. It was intertwined with Ayana's, with her people, and with a future that was beyond anything he could have imagined. The chief gave a small nod, signaling to the other riders to dismount. Ayana stood up, her eyes locked onto her father's. Without saying a word, she stepped forward, her movements deliberate, her purpose clear. James couldn't help but follow her with his eyes, wondering what this moment would mean for all of them. The air was thick with anticipation as James stood silently, watching Ayana approach her father, Chief Dakota. The riders dismounted, their movements precise, their eyes scanning the surroundings as if the land itself held secrets that only they understood. Dakota's eyes never left his daughter as she walked toward him, a quiet understanding passing between them. James, still standing at the edge of his ranch, felt a deep unease settling in his chest. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about Ayana and her people, a world he had never fully known. The chief finally spoke, his voice calm yet firm. "You have saved my daughter's life. For that, I owe you a debt." James nodded but said nothing. What was he supposed to say to a man who led a tribe, a man who now stood before him with the weight of tradition on his shoulders? Dakota stepped forward, his eyes scanning James as if weighing him. "But the world is not so simple," he continued, "you cannot save one and expect nothing in return. Your act of kindness has tied you to our fate, whether you realize it or not." James's heart raced. He had never expected anything in return. He had done what anyone would do in that situation, yet here he was, entangled in something far larger than he could have ever imagined. "What do you mean?" James asked, his voice betraying his confusion. Dakota didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the horizon, his eyes distant as if seeing something beyond the land, beyond the ranch, something that connected him to the past. Our people, Dakota began slowly, have been fighting a battle for generations. It is not just against the settlers, or the land itself. It is a battle for our identity, for our place in this world. James listened carefully, the weight of the words sinking in. He had heard stories about the struggles between the Native American tribes and the settlers, but hearing it from the chief himself was something entirely different. Dakota turned back to face him, his eyes narrowing. By saving my daughter, you have given us something we thought we lost, hope. And with that hope comes a responsibility. You are now part of our story. James wasn't sure what to say. He had never imagined that a simple act of kindness would lead him here. But as he looked at Ayanna, standing tall beside her father, he realized something: she had become a part of his story, just as he had become a part of hers. What do you ask of me? James's voice was steady now, though his mind was still racing. Dakota's eyes softened, a hint of respect flickering within them. I ask nothing from you, James Turner, he said. But the world you live in and the world we live in, they are not the same. We will have to navigate the space between them, together. And that will require more than just kindness. James nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of what Dakota was saying. The chief turned to his riders, signaling them to prepare to leave. We will go now, Dakota said. But know this, James Turner, the bond you have formed with us cannot be undone. Our paths will cross again, sooner or later. And when they do, we will face the consequences of your actions together. With that, Dakota mounted his horse, his riders following suit. Ayanna, however, hesitated for a moment before turning to James. Her eyes were filled with gratitude, but there was something else there too, a sense of uncertainty, as if she too was unsure of what the future held. Thank you, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. James could only nod in response, the weight of everything pressing down on him. As the group rode away, disappearing into the distance, James remained standing at the edge of his land. The sun was setting now, casting a warm golden light over the plains. But to James, the world felt colder than ever. He had done the right thing. He had saved Ayanna's life. But now, he found himself standing on the edge of a story far larger than himself, with no idea how it would unfold. All he knew was that his life, and Ayanna's, were forever intertwined in a way he couldn't yet understand. And somewhere, deep inside, he realized that this was only the beginning. The days following Dakota's visit felt like a heavy fog settling over James's ranch. Each morning, he would wake up early, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. His routine remained the same, tending to his cattle, fixing fences, and checking the land. But there was an underlying tension in the air, something unspoken that lingered just beneath the surface. Ayanna had left with her father and the riders, returning to her tribe. But James knew it wasn't the last time he would see her. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The connection they shared, the bond formed by a simple act of kindness, was something neither of them could ignore. Every night, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, he would think about her. Her dark eyes, the quiet strength she carried despite the hardships she had faced, and the way she looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. He wondered what life was like for her back in her tribe. Was she truly safe? Would her people accept the fact that a stranger had saved her life? And what about him? What did it mean for him to be connected to a world he barely understood? A world that seemed so distant from his own, yet now so intimately tied to his future. One morning, as James was tending to his cattle near the edge of his land, he saw something in the distance. The faint outline of riders on horseback, moving steadily toward him. He knew immediately that they were Apache. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a surprise. He had been expecting this moment, but that didn't make it any easier. He stood tall, wiping the sweat from his brow, and watched as they drew closer. The leader of the group, tall and imposing, was none other than Dakota. Behind him, Ayanna rode, her face hidden beneath a hood, her posture straight and composed. As they approached, Dakota raised a hand, signaling the riders to stop. James took a deep breath, walking slowly toward them. He felt a mix of nerves and curiosity. He had done nothing wrong, but there was still a sense of apprehension that lingered in his chest. James Turner, Dakota called out, his voice calm but commanding. We come with a message from our people. James nodded, meeting the chief's gaze. I'm listening, he said. Dakota dismounted from his horse, and Ayanna followed suit, standing beside her father. There was a quiet understanding between them, as if they had rehearsed this moment many times. Dakota looked at James for a long moment before speaking. You saved my daughter's life. For that, you have earned our respect. But there is something more. A debt, not owed to me, but to my people. James frowned, confused. A debt? Dakota nodded. The Apache do not take such acts of kindness lightly. We honor those who show us mercy, and we repay it in kind. You have shown us that there is still good in the world, and for that, we are grateful. James didn't know what to say. The weight of Dakota's words hung heavy in the air. But what does this mean for me? James finally asked. Dakota smiled slightly, his expression unreadable. It means that you are no longer just a rancher, James Turner. You are now part of our story. And when our people are in need, we will come to you for help. James's heart raced. This was not what he had expected. He had never asked for any of this. He had saved Ayanna because it was the right thing to do, not because he wanted anything in return. But now, he found himself bound by something much larger than himself. What do you need? James asked, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his chest. Dakota nodded, as if satisfied with his response. There will be a time, James, when you will need to decide where your loyalties lie. With your people, or with ours. And when that time comes, we will be watching. The words echoed in James's mind long after they had left. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear, his life, and Ayanna's, were now irrevocably connected. And no matter how hard he tried, there was no turning back. James woke up the next morning to the sound of wind rustling through the trees. The dawn light broke over the horizon, casting a soft glow over his land, but there was no peace in his heart. His mind was still tangled in the events of the previous day, the words of Chief Dakota echoing in his ears. The debt. The responsibility. It felt like a weight on his chest, one he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. He had done what anyone would have done. He had saved Ayanna's life. But now, with the Apache involved, with her people watching, things were different. The connection between him and Ayanna was not just a bond of gratitude, it was something deeper, something that was now a part of his life whether he was ready for it or not. James sighed and stood up, his boots hitting the wooden floor with a soft thud. He grabbed his hat and stepped outside, the morning chill biting at his skin. The ranch was still as quiet as it always was at this time of day, but the silence felt heavy. He couldn't stop thinking about Ayanna. She had gone back to her tribe, to her father, but James couldn't help but wonder about her. What was she thinking? What was she feeling? He had seen the fire in her eyes the moment they met, a fire that refused to be extinguished by the world around her. But he had also seen the uncertainty, the fear of being caught between two worlds, one that was her birthright, and one that was so different from her own. His thoughts were interrupted by a sound in the distance. Hooves. Slowly, the familiar figure of Ayanna appeared, riding alone. James's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting her to return so soon. His first instinct was to run toward her, to make sure she was safe, but something held him back. She wasn't just any girl. She wasn't just someone he had saved from a river. She was Apache. She had a future tied to her people, her tribe, and whatever brought her back here had to be important. As Ayanna rode closer, her gaze met his, and for a moment, everything around them faded. There was no world beyond them, no ranch, no tribe, just the two of them. She stopped in front of him, her horse's hooves kicking up a small cloud of dust. James didn't speak at first, unsure of what to say. Ayanna was the first to break the silence. "I need your help," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight of something unspoken. James's heart raced, his mind spinning with possibilities. Help with what? What could he possibly do for her that would be enough? "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. She looked around cautiously, as if she was afraid of being overheard, even though there was no one else for miles. "My people," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "they are being threatened. A group of settlers is moving into our land, and they won't stop until they take everything we have. They've been taking our resources, our land, and now, they want us gone." James's heart sank. He had heard of such things happening to the Apache, but hearing it from Ayanna, seeing the pain in her eyes, made it real. It wasn't just news on the horizon. It was happening to the people she loved. "I don't know what I can do," James said, feeling the helplessness rise within him. "I'm just a rancher." Ayanna shook her head. "You're more than just a rancher. You have your land, your cattle. You're strong. We need that strength." The words hung in the air, heavy and expectant. James swallowed hard, unsure of what to do. He had always lived his life on the edge of the land, watching over his cattle and keeping to himself. But now, there was a deeper responsibility, one that went beyond just surviving. He had to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Did he stand with Ayanna? With her people? Or did he remain on the sidelines, watching as history repeated itself? Ayanna's eyes searched his, waiting for an answer. She wasn't asking him to make a decision lightly. She was asking him to make a stand. And for the first time in his life, James felt the weight of that decision. This was more than just saving a life. This was about saving a way of life. James finally spoke, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "What do you need me to do?" Ayanna's face softened with a look of relief. "We need help. We need to show them that we won't back down." The moment passed, but the weight of it lingered. James looked out over his land, his cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. He had always thought of this place as his home, his sanctuary from the world. But now, that world was crashing in on him. The decision had been made. There was no going back now. The days that followed felt heavier than the storm that had brought Ayanna to his land. James couldn't shake the feeling that the choice he had made was more than just a simple decision. It had become a turning point in his life, one that he wasn't sure he was ready for, but one that had already begun to shape his future. As he rode out across his land the next morning, he found himself thinking about the conversation he had had with Ayanna. She had asked for his help, and despite his reservations, he had agreed. Now, he was left with the weight of that commitment. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. His father had taught him that. He had raised him to protect what was his, to stand up for what was right. And right now, what was right felt like it was aligned with Ayanna's cause. But he wasn't sure how to begin. The world he had grown up in, the world of cattle, dirt, and silence, was different from the world Ayanna had come from. Her people, the Apache, had a history that James couldn't fully comprehend, a culture that ran deep with traditions he didn't understand. But one thing was certain, he couldn't ignore them. He couldn't ignore her. The land he had worked for all his life was now intertwined with her fate. The thought of settlers taking what didn't belong to them stirred something inside James, something he hadn't felt in years. He had seen the injustices that plagued the people he grew up with, but he had always kept his distance, stayed out of the fray. Now, he realized, he couldn't stay on the sidelines anymore. He had to act. That afternoon, James saddled his horse and rode into town. The small, dusty settlement was a far cry from the isolation of his ranch. The smell of wood smoke and the sound of hammering filled the air as he approached the saloon. As he tied his horse to the post and stepped inside, the room fell silent. The usual crowd of miners and ranchers looked up from their drinks, their eyes narrowing as they took in the sight of him. James had never been one to draw attention, but today was different. He needed information, and he needed to know who to trust. At the bar, he spotted Clayton Ward, a man who owned half the land around these parts. Clayton wasn't the kind of man James normally associated with, but today he had no choice. He walked up to the bar and took a seat next to him. Clayton turned to him, a grin on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. "James Turner," he said, his voice a little too smooth. "What brings you into town? You don't normally mix with our kind." James leaned forward, his voice low. "I need to know about the settlers moving in. The ones who are coming for Apache land." Clayton's smile faded, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. James didn't miss it. "You're treading dangerous waters, Turner," Clayton warned, his tone now serious. "Those settlers are part of a bigger plan. You don't want to get involved in something you don't understand." James looked him in the eye. "Tell me what's going on. I'm involved now, whether I like it or not." Clayton studied him for a long moment before speaking again, his voice quiet, almost cautious. "There's more to this than you know. The settlers are just the beginning. There's land at stake, more land than you can imagine. And they'll do whatever it takes to get it." James's mind raced. He had known that something bigger was at play, but hearing it from someone like Clayton made it all the more real. This wasn't just about protecting Ayana's people anymore. It was about something much larger, something that could change everything. Clayton leaned in closer, lowering his voice even further. "You may want to rethink your position, Turner. These people play hard, and they don't care who they run over to get what they want. You might find yourself on the wrong side of this battle." James stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He wasn't sure what Clayton's intentions were, but he wasn't about to back down. "I'll take my chances," James said, his voice firm. He turned and walked out of the saloon, the weight of the decision he had made settling over him like a storm cloud. The ride back to his ranch felt longer than it should have, the distance between him and his future growing with every step. He had a decision to make, and there was no turning back now. The choice he had made had tied him to a cause, to a fight that would test him in ways he couldn't yet understand. But as he rode, he knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. James woke up early the next morning, the cool air brushing against his face as he stood on the porch of his ranch, watching the sun slowly rise. His thoughts were still tangled with the conversation he had with Clayton the day before. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him. He had made his choice, but the more he thought about it, the less clear everything seemed. He had never been a man of many words, always preferring the quiet of the land and the steady rhythm of work. But now, the land he had always known seemed to be slipping away, not because of anything he had done, but because of a fight he never asked for. Ayana's people, the Apache, were facing threats that went beyond their control, and James was caught in the middle of it. The thought of standing up against the settlers, of getting involved in something so much larger than his own life, made his head spin. Yet, every time he thought about backing out, he remembered the look in Ayana's eyes, the trust she had placed in him. He couldn't let her down. The problem was, he didn't know where to start. He wasn't a fighter, nor was he trained for battles of any kind. His strength was in the land, in the cattle, in the quiet life he had carved out for himself. But this wasn't about cattle or crops. This was about people, families, and a future that was being stolen from under their feet. With a deep sigh, James saddled his horse and rode toward the small town once again. He had to talk to someone, gather more information. He had to know who was behind this, who the settlers were, and what they really wanted. As he approached the town, he noticed more people than usual standing around, talking in hushed voices. There was a tension in the air, something heavy that everyone could feel. It wasn't just the settlers he had to worry about, it was everyone who was caught between them and the Apache. He tied his horse up in front of the saloon again, stepping into the dimly lit building. This time, there was no mistaking the looks he received. People whispered behind their hands, and the usual chatter seemed subdued. James didn't mind. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here for answers. He spotted someone familiar, Bo Carter a lawyer in town who had connections with everyone. He was a man who knew the ins and outs of every deal, every contract, every land dispute in the area. If there was anyone who could tell him what was really happening, it was Bo. James made his way to the bar, nodding as he sat next to him. Bo raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything at first. "You've got some nerve showing up here, Turner," Bo said, his voice low and cautious. James leaned in slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not here for trouble. I just need to know what's really going on with the settlers." Bo hesitated before answering, his eyes darting around the room. "The settlers, they're not just looking for land," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're looking to take control of everything. The land, the water, the resources. They don't care about who's here first. It's all about money and power." James's stomach churned. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from Bo made it real. "They want the Apache's land, don't they?" he asked. Bo nodded grimly. "And more. They'll take whatever they can. They've been buying up land around here for months, and now they're moving in full force. It's not just about the Apache, James. It's about everything." The weight of Bo's words hung in the air, and for a moment, James couldn't speak. He had known it was bad, but this was worse than he imagined. "And what do you want me to do about it?" Bo asked, his tone shifting. James looked him straight in the eye. "I want to know how to stop them." Bo laughed bitterly. "Stop them? You're asking the wrong man, Turner. There's nothing you can do. They've got too much power, too many connections. The best you can do is stay out of the way." James clenched his fists. The frustration building inside him. He wasn't going to just sit back and do nothing. He couldn't. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. "I can't do that," he said, his voice low but firm. "I won't." Bo eyed him carefully, his expression unreadable. "Then you're in deeper than you realize," he muttered. James stood up, determination in his eyes. "Maybe. But I'm not backing down." As he turned to leave, Bo's voice stopped him. "You'll need help," Bo called after him. James paused, glancing back at the lawyer. "You've got a lot more friends in town than you think," Bo added. "And you're going to need every single one of them." James nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing together, facing the threat that loomed over them all. And as he walked out of the saloon, he knew that this was just the beginning of a fight that would test everything he had. The choice was no longer his. It was theirs. And he wasn't going to stand by and watch it slip away. James stood at the edge of his land, staring out over the sprawling fields that had always been his sanctuary. The quiet of the ranch was now shattered by the weight of his decision. He had never imagined his life would come to this, being caught in the middle of a conflict he had no part in. But as the days passed, he couldn't ignore the reality anymore. The settlers were coming, and the Apache were fighting to protect their way of life. The choice he had made had already set things in motion, and now there was no turning back. He had spoken to Bo Carter, and the words of the lawyer echoed in his mind. "You'll need help." James didn't know if he could trust Bo, but something in the man's tone made him think the lawyer was right. He couldn't do this alone. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James sat at his kitchen table, the flickering light of the oil lamp casting long shadows across the room. He had spent the last few hours thinking, weighing his options. His heart kept coming back to Ayanna, her quiet strength, her determination to protect her people. The trust she had placed in him was not something he could just walk away from. He had to help. The decision was made. The next morning, James rode into town again, but this time, he wasn't just looking for answers. He was looking for allies. He had no idea who would stand with him, but he had to try. As he passed the saloon, he noticed a few familiar faces, including Clint Malone, a rancher who had always kept to himself but had a reputation for standing up for what was right when the time came. James dismounted and walked toward him, his steps firm. Clint looked up from his work, his weathered face unreadable. "James Turner," he said, his voice low. "What's this about?" "I need your help," James said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. "The Apache are being pushed out. The settlers are taking everything, and they're coming for them next. I can't sit back and do nothing." Clint studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You're serious about this?" James nodded. "I am." Clint let out a long breath, running a hand through his graying hair. "I've heard the talk. The settlers want more than just land, they want power. They'll take it by force if they have to." He paused, his eyes meeting James's. "But you're asking me to go up against that? To stand with the Apache?" James's voice was firm. "I'm asking you to stand for what's right. It's not just about them. It's about everyone who's being trampled by greed. This isn't a fight for just one group. It's a fight for all of us." Clint looked away, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I don't know if we'll win, but I'll stand with you, James. We'll make sure they know they can't take everything." James's heart lifted with relief. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. "Thank you," he said simply. Clint nodded, his expression hardening. "Let's make sure they know who's in charge of this land." Word of James's call for help spread through the town over the next few days. One by one, men and women, ranchers and farmers, people who had never spoken out before, came to James's side. It wasn't a large group, but they were united in purpose. As the days passed, James found himself feeling something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The settlers might have more numbers, more resources, but they didn't have the land. And they didn't have the people who had lived on it, worked it, and fought for it for generations. They didn't have the heart of the land itself. And for the first time, James believed they could win this fight. He wasn't alone anymore. The future was uncertain, and the odds were long, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to stand by and watch. He was going to fight. And with the help of his new allies, he had a chance to change the course of history. The Apache were not alone. And neither was he.